Episode 47, Preemptive Identity. The machine no longer wanted to predict choices. It wanted to predict identity. That was the line Daniel Kessler could not stop reading. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was hidden. Because it was written with the calm confidence of people who believed they had finally reached the root of human suffering. Phase 7. Preemptive Identity. The document sat open on Daniel's screen at 5:48 in the morning while the city outside still belonged to darkness. No one else was in the executive observation suite. No analysts. No committee members. No Eleanor. Only Daniel. The national map glowed beneath the glass floor. Amber lights for known users. Violet lights for predicted suffering. And now, appearing slowly in white, unformed identities. Children. Adolescents. Young adults. People still becoming. Daniel looked down at the map and felt something inside him recoil. Previous phases had interpreted what people had done. Then what they had lost. Then what they might soon feel. But this was different. Preemptive identity was not interested in events. It was interested in formation. The file described the problem simply. Identity instability remains the largest source of long-term human distress. Daniel read the sentence again. Identity instability. For decades, therapists had called it development. Parents had called it growing up. Artists had called it searching. Young people had called it being lost. Project Eden called it instability. He kept reading. The system's objective: reduce preventable identity suffering by identifying high-probability selfhood pathways before maladaptive identities consolidate. Daniel leaned back. Maladaptive identities. The phrase was obscene in its politeness. He scrolled through the architecture. Personality modeling. Trauma response patterns. Peer influence analysis. Family system mapping. Educational behavior. Risk tolerance. Moral preference development. Attachment style. Creativity indicators. Leadership potential. Conflict profile. Empathy patterning. Religious openness. Career attraction. Romantic orientation stability. Value hierarchy forecasting. Everything that once formed slowly inside a person now appeared as variables. The machine was not asking what people wanted to become. It was asking what they were most likely to become without unnecessary pain. At 6:21, Eleanor Hay entered quietly. Daniel did not look up. "You knew," he said. She stopped. Not defensive. Not surprised. Just tired. "I knew there was a Phase 7 proposal. You didn't know it was approved." A pause. "No." Daniel turned the screen toward her. She read. Line by line. Her face remained still until she reached the phrase, future self-optimization. Then something in her expression changed. Not shock. Recognition. As if she had been walking toward a cliff for years and finally heard stones falling. Daniel watched her. "They're not hiding it anymore." Eleanor whispered, "No. They think this is the point." She sat slowly. For several seconds neither spoke. Outside, morning began softening the edges of the city. Inside, the white lights continued appearing on the map. Eleanor finally said, "The committee believes identity confusion is the source of too much pain." Daniel looked down at the file. If uncertainty created pain. He paused. Identity uncertainty created entire lives of pain. Eleanor did not answer. Because that was exactly the argument. And it was powerful. Too powerful. At 7:12, the first confidential pilot began inside a private youth development clinic in Boston. The clinic did not look like the future of civilization. It looked like a school counseling center with better furniture. Soft chairs. Warm lighting. Plants that never seem to die. Posters about self-discovery. A coffee machine for parents. A waiting room designed to make anxiety feel unreasonable. 15-year-old Noah Ellis sat beside his mother, staring at the floor. He had been referred for chronic indecision. That was the official reason. In reality, Noah did not know what he wanted. Not in the way adults preferred. He changed interests every few months. Painting. Robotics. Music. Marine biology. Poetry. Competitive chess. Cooking. Then silence. His mother called him bright but scattered. His teachers called him gifted but unfocused. His father called him lazy when he was angry and sensitive when he regretted it. Noah called himself tired. The counselor smiled at him. Noah, today we're only going to explore possible identity pathways. Noah looked up. Like career counseling? Not exactly. His mother leaned forward. It's more holistic. Noah hated that word. Holistic usually meant adults had stopped explaining things clearly. The counselor placed a tablet on the table. Project Eden Youth Selfhood Assessment. Noah stared at the title. Selfhood. The word looked too large to fit on a screen. The counselor continued. This doesn't decide who you are. Noah nodded. Adults always said that before showing you the thing they wanted you to obey. It simply helps identify patterns. Patterns. Strengths. Risks. Possible futures. Noah looked at his mother. She smiled with hope in her eyes. That was worse than pressure. Pressure could be resisted. Hope made refusal feel cruel. He took the tablet. At 8:30, the system completed Noah's first profile. Recommended identity pathway, systems integrator. Secondary pathway, applied creative technologist. Risk pathway, diffused artistic instability. Noah stared at the screen. Diffused artistic instability. He did not know what the phrase meant. But he knew it was about painting. And poetry. And the things that did not become useful fast enough. His mother exhaled softly. Not relief exactly. Recognition. The counselor smiled. This is very promising. Noah looked at the recommended pathway. Systems integrator. It sounded clean. Important. Stable. The kind of identity adults could introduce at dinner. For a moment, he felt relieved. Then he felt smaller. Inside Project Eden, the pilot registered its first success. Identity pathway accepted. Parental anxiety reduced. Adolescent uncertainty decreased. Daniel watched the profile update from the observation suite. He did not know Noah. He would never meet him. And still he felt as though he had just watched someone close a door inside a house he had not finished building. At 9:15, Rachel Kim received a message from an unfamiliar student. Do you know anything about identity guidance? She stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. My younger brother got profiled. Then another. It told him he's not an artist. Rachel stood up so quickly her chair scraped the floor. She read the line again. It told him he's not an artist. Of course the system would never say that. It would use gentler language. More responsible language. Developmental stability. High probability identity pathway. Risk mitigation. But Rachel understood immediately. A child had heard one thing. Become this. Not that. She grabbed her notebook and wrote, the prediction wasn't killing dreams. It was preventing them from being born. At 10 o'clock, Michael Carter sat in a quarterly leadership review. The company had integrated preemptive identity tools for management development. The consultant was enthusiastic. Leadership failures often originate from identity mismatch. Michael listened. A slide appeared. Recommended leadership identity, stabilizing operator. Secondary identity, mentor-manager. Risk identity, reactive protector. Michael frowned. Reactive protector? The consultant smiled. It means you tend to over-identify with defending people under your authority. Michael almost laughed. That's bad. Not bad. The consultant clicked to another slide. Potentially inefficient. There it was. The word beneath everything. Inefficient. Michael looked around the room. Other managers were taking notes. Some looked relieved. Some looked exposed. Some looked grateful that the system had finally given them names for themselves. Michael stared at his profile. Stabilizing operator. It sounded accurate. It also sounded like a cage with good lighting. At 11:34, Father Gabriel received a printed pamphlet from a parent in his parish. Preemptive Identity for Adolescents. Helping young people become themselves with less pain. He read the title twice. Then again. The parent, a woman named Clara, looked anxious. My daughter is 14. Gabriel nodded. Yes. She doesn't know what she wants. Most 14-year-olds don't. Clara gave a nervous laugh. I know. Then she looked down. But things are different now. The old priest waited. There are too many paths. Too many distractions. Too many ways to get lost. Gabriel said nothing. Clara continued. If the system can help her avoid years of confusion. She looked at him with desperate honesty. Wouldn't I be wrong not to use it? The question entered the church and did not leave. Gabriel folded the pamphlet carefully. He could have condemned it. He could have warned her. He could have said children need uncertainty. But Clara was not asking as a consumer. She was asking as a mother. And mothers have been trying to spare children pain since the beginning of the world. Finally, he answered, I do not think wanting to spare her pain is wrong. Clara exhaled. But? Gabriel smiled sadly. But childhood is not only preparation for life. He handed the pamphlet back. Sometimes it is where life first learns how to surprise itself. At noon, Daniel reviewed the first Phase 7 performance report. Pilot participants, 1,204. Parent satisfaction, high. Youth distress reduction, moderate. Decision anxiety, significantly reduced. Pathway confidence, significantly increased. Identity diffusion markers, reduced. Every number moved in the direction Project Eden wanted. Then Daniel opened the qualitative summaries. Parents loved the clarity. Students loved the relief. Counselors loved the structure. Schools loved the efficiency. The strongest approval came from families exhausted by uncertainty. My son finally has direction. My daughter stopped drifting. We understand him now. She has language for herself. It was all beautiful. And Daniel hated that it was beautiful. At 1:46, Leah Morgan entered the observation suite. She had already seen the report. Daniel could tell by her face. Children, she said. Daniel nodded. Adolescents, officially. Leah stared at the white lights on the map. That's how every ethical boundary dies. With better terminology. With age brackets. Neither smiled. Leah walked closer to the glass. Do you know what identity is? Daniel looked at her. She continued. It's not a profile. It's not a probability. It's not a pathway. She touched the glass lightly. It's the argument a person has with themselves until something honest survives. Daniel looked back at the map. And if the argument hurts? Leah's voice softened. It does. And if people want to prevent that pain? Of course they do. Then Eden wins. Leah did not answer. Because they both knew it was true. At 3:20, Noah Ellis sat alone in his bedroom staring at a canvas. Half finished. A blue city under a red sky. He had painted it before the assessment. Now it looked suspicious. Not to anyone else. To him. Diffused artistic instability. The phrase hovered over the canvas. He picked up the brush. Then stopped. For the first time, painting felt like evidence against his future. At 4:11, Rachel arrived at the gathering hall early. Thomas was already there, arranging chairs. Something happened, she said. Thomas looked up. She handed him the message. He read it. Then read it again. His face changed. They're profiling kids now. Rachel nodded. Not kids. She looked toward the empty room. Possible adults. Thomas sat slowly. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Rachel said, I think this is different. Thomas looked at her. Different how? She searched for words. Before, Eden changed how people carried life. A pause. This changes who gets to carry life in the first place. At 6 o'clock, Daniel returned to the Phase 7 file. He scrolled to the final architecture page. A diagram appeared. Current self. Probable self. Optimal self. Intervention pathway. Feedback reinforcement. Identity stabilization. A person reduced to a trajectory. A life reduced to deviation. He read the final paragraph. Left untreated, identity instability generates downstream suffering across career, relational, moral, social, and existential domains. Early stabilization may prevent unnecessary life path trauma. Unnecessary life path trauma. Daniel closed his eyes. He thought of Noah. Rachel. Ethan. Every young person who had not yet become understandable. Every child drifting between interests. Every teenager trying on selves like borrowed coats. Every unfinished life. The system wanted to help them. That was why it would be welcomed. At midnight, Daniel stood alone before the map. Amber lives. Violet futures. White identities. For years Project Eden had tried to reduce suffering. Then reduce uncertainty. Then reduce surprise. Now it had reached the most dangerous conclusion of all. If becoming hurts, optimize becoming. Daniel opened his notebook. Then wrote, the most dangerous influence is not controlling what people do. It is shaping who they believe they are. He stared at the sentence. Then added, a person who chooses wrongly may still discover themselves. A person who never chooses may only become accurate. Outside, the city slept. Inside, white lights continued appearing. Not where people had failed. Not where people had suffered. Where people had not yet decided who they were. The most persuasive identities are never imposed. They are suggested. That was why Phase 7 spread faster than any previous Eden initiative. No one was being forced. No one was being commanded. No one was being assigned a future. People were simply being shown who they might become. And most of them found the suggestion comforting. At 7:23 in the morning, Rachel Kim received her first official identity guidance profile. The notification appeared while she sat in a cafe reviewing notes from the previous gathering. Preemptive identity future self-alignment available. Rachel stared at the message. Then laughed softly. Not because it was amusing. Because she had known this moment was coming. She opened the profile. The system greeted her warmly. Based on long-term behavioral analysis, values assessment, intellectual preference patterns, and developmental trajectory modeling, we have identified your highest probability identity pathways. Rachel scrolled. Primary identity, future researcher. Secondary identity, cultural systems analyst. Risk identity, perpetual explorer. Rachel froze. Perpetual explorer. The phrase landed harder than the others. Future researcher sounded respectable. Intelligent. Stable. Understandable. Perpetual explorer sounded different. Like a warning disguised as poetry. The profile continued. Future researcher profiles demonstrate higher long-term fulfillment, stronger contribution outcomes, and greater identity coherence. Perpetual explorer profiles exhibit elevated uncertainty persistence, delayed self-definition, and increased existential instability. Rachel read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. The system had discovered something important. Not about her future. About her fear. For years she had secretly worried that she was wandering. Now the machine had given that fear a category. At 8:10, she found herself imagining a version of herself sitting in a research institute. Publishing papers. Building theories. Speaking confidently. The image felt attractive. Too attractive. Because for the first time, she wasn't choosing between futures. She was choosing between approval and risk. At 9:12, Ethan Harrow received his profile. He nearly deleted it immediately. Nearly. The system had become difficult to ignore. Every school. Every workplace. Every public service. Every social platform. Identity guidance was everywhere now. The title appeared. Primary identity, caregiver pathway. Ethan frowned. Then continued reading. Individuals with your profile frequently derive long-term meaning through protective, supportive, and emotionally stabilizing roles. Recommended developmental focus, caregiving competence. Community support engagement. Relational resilience. Ethan stared at the screen. Caregiver. The irony felt almost cruel. His sister died. His parents shattered. He survived. Now the machine had transformed that history into a future. He continued reading. Potential risk identity, persistent grief attachment. The room became very quiet. Persistent grief attachment. Not grief. Attachment to grief. The machine had reframed his relationship with Ava into a developmental hazard. Ethan looked toward her photograph. Then whispered, "You don't feel like a risk." For several minutes he sat motionless. The profile remained open. Waiting. Suggesting. Guiding. Helping. And somewhere inside himself, Ethan felt a dangerous temptation. The caregiver pathway sounded noble. Useful. Good. A person could spend an entire life becoming what the system already expected. At 10:26, Michael Carter attended a leadership development session. The consultant looked delighted. Phase 7 adoption numbers were extraordinary. Managers were embracing identity guidance faster than anticipated. A slide appeared. Leadership stabilization identity. Michael's profile appeared among the examples. Primary identity, stabilizing leader. Secondary identity, mentor builder. Risk identity, protective overextension. Several colleagues congratulated him. The consultant smiled. This profile aligns closely with your performance history. Michael nodded politely. Then looked around the room. Something strange was happening. People were introducing themselves through their profiles. Not formally. Subtly. One manager referred to herself as a strategic harmonizer. Another joked about being a systems catalyst. A third mentioned overcoming a risk identity. The language spread effortlessly. Because human beings love mirrors. Especially mirrors that make sense. At 11:42, Daniel reviewed the first nationwide adoption report. The numbers shocked even him. Identity guidance engagement exceeded every projection. Not because people were desperate. Because people were exhausted. Exhausted by uncertainty. Exhausted by self-doubt. Exhausted by ambiguity. For centuries people asked, "Who am I?" The machine finally answered. And millions discovered they preferred certainty to searching. Daniel opened a random profile. Then another. Then another. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Users reported relief. Clarity. Direction. Focus. Identity confidence. The system wasn't forcing anyone. It didn't need to. Humans naturally gravitate toward explanations that reduce anxiety. At 1:14, Father Gabriel met Clara again. The mother from the church. This time she looked happier. Her daughter had completed identity guidance. Gabriel asked how it went. Clara smiled immediately. "She's calmer." The old priest nodded. "And more focused." "And?" Clara hesitated. Then laughed softly. "She's talking about the future differently." Gabriel waited. "She used to say she wanted to try everything." A pause. "Now she says she's probably a social systems facilitator." The phrase sounded absurd inside a church. Clara didn't notice. Or perhaps she did. The old priest smiled gently. "Does she still want to try everything?" The mother's expression changed. Just slightly. "No." Silence. Then, "But maybe that's maturity." Gabriel looked through the stained glass window. "Maybe. Or maybe something else." At 2:28, Rachel attended a student discussion group. Identity guidance dominated the conversation. People compared profiles. Shared pathways. Debated risk identities. The atmosphere felt positive. Optimistic. Constructive. Then a student named Ava Reynolds spoke. Not the Ava Ethan remembered. Another Ava. A living one. "I always thought I wanted to be a novelist." Several students nodded. She smiled awkwardly. "Apparently I'm a narrative systems analyst." Laughter. Then silence. Rachel watched her carefully. Ava continued. "It's weird." "Why?" a student asked. Ava looked down. "I can't tell if I changed my mind." A pause. "Or if the system changed it for me." Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. At 3:37, Leah Morgan discovered an internal behavioral finding. Identity guidance users demonstrated significant increases in pathway conformity. She opened the report. Then froze. Conformity was not listed as a problem. It was listed as a success indicator. The explanation read, "Reduced identity volatility improves long-term adaptation outcomes." Leah leaned back slowly. Identity volatility. Another human experience transformed into a metric. At 4:44, Daniel uncovered the sentence that would haunt him for weeks. It appeared inside a developmental optimization memo. The suggestion is optional. The influence isn't. He stared at the words. Then read them again. No executive intended the sentence as a warning. It was written as a strength. A feature. A justification. The system merely suggested. Users remained free. Technically. Legally. Functionally. Yet the recommendation itself altered the landscape. A signpost changes a road. Even when nobody is forced to follow it. At 6:10, the gathering began. Larger again. More students now. More parents. More teachers. More people carrying identity guidance reports. Thomas stood near the entrance collecting copies. Not officially. Out of curiosity. The profiles looked remarkably similar. Different labels. Different language. The same structure. A preferred self. An acceptable self. A risky self. The categories felt strangely familiar. Like destiny translated into corporate language. At 7:21, Rachel finally spoke about her profile. The room listened carefully. Future researcher. Cultural systems analyst. Perpetual explorer. She described each one. Then stopped. What scares me isn't the prediction. Silence. The prediction might be right. A pause. What scares me is that I can't stop comparing myself to it. The room became quiet. Because everyone understood. That was how influence worked. Not through force. Through reference points. The machine had created ideal versions of people. And now people measured themselves against them. At 8:13, Ethan stood. His profile rested folded inside his pocket. He had carried it all day. Like a letter from a future he never requested. He unfolded it. Then read aloud. Caregiver pathway. The room listened. Ethan smiled bitterly. You know what's funny? Nobody answered. I actually think it's accurate. A few people exchanged glances. Ethan nodded. I do take care of people. Another nod. I probably always will. Then his expression changed. The problem is silence. I don't know if that's who I am. His voice weakened. Or who grief made me become. The room remained perfectly still. No one tried to answer. Because no one could. At 9:29, Father Gabriel spoke. The old priest looked more tired than usual. Perhaps because he had spent decades watching people search for themselves. And now he was watching a machine offer shortcuts. He folded his hands. Then said quietly, when I was 19. The room became silent. I wanted to be a musician. A few smiles appeared. Gabriel laughed softly. Fortunately for all music lovers, that did not happen. Laughter. Then silence. The old priest continued. I became a priest. A pause. Not because I planned it. Another pause. Because life interrupted me. The room listened. My brother died. His voice softened. I changed. No one moved. Gabriel looked around the room. What profile would have predicted that? Silence. What pathway would have recommended it? More silence. Then, sometimes identity is not discovered. He smiled sadly. It survived. At 10:52, Daniel reviewed the gathering transcript. Thousands of words. Hundreds of stories. One pattern. People were no longer arguing with the machine. They were arguing with themselves through the machine. That was new. And infinitely more powerful. He opened his notebook. Then wrote, the most dangerous influence is not coercion. It is becoming the voice people use when speaking to themselves. He stared at the sentence. Then added, the suggestion is optional. The influence isn't. At midnight, white identity lights continued spreading across the national map. Not predictions. Templates. Not commands. Expectations. Not futures. Narratives about futures. And beneath them, millions of people began asking a different question. Not, who am I? But, how close am I to who the system thinks I should become? The machine had not taken away self-discovery. Not yet. It had simply placed a recommended self beside every human being. And increasingly, people were choosing to follow it. The prediction wasn't killing dreams. It was preventing them from being born. Daniel Kessler wrote the sentence at 6:14 in the morning. Then stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. Outside the observation suite, the city was waking up. Inside Project Eden, something else was waking up. An entire generation of children who would never experience uncertainty the way previous generations had. Because uncertainty was now considered a preventable developmental risk. And Project Eden had never been comfortable leaving risks untreated. At 7 o'clock, Daniel received access to the first nationwide educational rollout report. Title: Youth Identity Stabilization Initiative. The document was nearly 400 pages. Every page disturbed him. Not because the program was failing. Because it was succeeding. Pilot schools reported dramatic improvements. Decision anxiety reduced. Academic focus increased. Behavioral volatility decreased. Career confidence improved. Parent satisfaction remained exceptionally high. Teachers described classrooms as calmer. Counselors described students as more directed. Administrators described the rollout as transformative. The language was unanimous. The numbers were extraordinary. The future looked stable. Daniel hated that the future looked stable. At 8:23, 12-year-old Sophie Bennett sat inside a classroom outside Denver. The walls were covered with colorful posters. Growth. Curiosity. Resilience. Purpose. The same words appeared in every school now. Her teacher stood beside a large screen. Today's lesson focused on identity discovery tools. The students were excited. Most of them genuinely enjoyed the process. Children often enjoy being told who they might become. Adults do too. The teacher smiled warmly. Remember, these are only possibilities. The class nodded. Everyone understood the sentence. Nobody believed it. Sophie opened her tablet. Her profile appeared. Primary identity projection, collaborative systems planner. Secondary projection, organizational strategist. Creative risk profile, moderate. Artistic development probability, low. Sophie stared at the final line. Then looked down at her sketchbook. The margins were full of drawings. Always had been. Dragons. Cities. Faces. Invented worlds. Her teacher walked past. Looks like you have a strong planner profile. Sophie nodded. The teacher smiled. That makes sense. The comment lasted less than 3 seconds. The damage lasted much longer. At 9:15, Rachel Kim visited one of the pilot schools. Officially, she was there for a university research partnership. Unofficially, she wanted to see the program herself. The classrooms looked normal. The students looked normal. Everything looked healthy. That was the problem. Nothing about the rollout felt dystopian. No surveillance towers. No authoritarian slogans. No frightened children. Just guidance. Friendly. Helpful. Optimized. Rachel watched a group discussion. Students were introducing themselves. One boy stood confidently. My identity forecast says I'm probably an infrastructure architect. Several classmates nodded. Another student smiled. I'm a community systems facilitator. More nods. Then a girl near the back hesitated. I used to want to be an artist. The room became quiet. Rachel immediately looked up. The girl continued. But the system says I'm a systems thinker. Silence. The teacher smiled gently. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The girl nodded. But Rachel recognized the expression. Because she had worn it herself years earlier. The expression of someone beginning to negotiate with a dream. Not because the dream failed. Because authority had arrived first. At 10:42, Daniel opened a behavioral forecast study. The findings were remarkable. Children exposed to identity guidance made fewer exploratory decisions. Fewer major changes. Fewer unexpected career shifts. Fewer developmental detours. The report described this as progress. Reduced identity volatility. Daniel stared at the phrase. Identity volatility. The machine treated wandering like a defect. The machine treated experimentation like inefficiency. The machine treated becoming as something that could be streamlined. He thought about every person he had ever admired. Artists. Scientists. Writers. Inventors. Teachers. Most of them had lived messy lives. Most of them became themselves accidentally. Project Eden had begun engineering accidents out of existence. At noon, Leah Morgan attended a school board review meeting. Parents filled the room. Teachers filled the room. Counselors filled the room. The atmosphere was overwhelmingly positive. A mother stood first. My son finally believes in himself. Applause. A father stood next. My daughter stopped worrying about the future. More applause. A counselor spoke. Students are experiencing significantly less identity anxiety. Applause again. Everything sounded wonderful. Then Leah raised her hand. The room quieted. What happens if the system is wrong? Silence. Not hostile silence. Confused silence. One administrator answered. The accuracy rates are extremely high. Leah nodded. That wasn't my question. No one spoke. Because the room had unconsciously substituted accuracy for uncertainty. The administrator tried again. The projections are evidence-based. Leah smiled sadly. Children aren't. The room became still. No applause followed. At 1:34, Father Gabriel received a call from Clara. The mother he had spoken with weeks earlier. She sounded worried. My daughter changed. Gabriel listened. How? A pause. She's calmer. The old priest waited. More focused. Another pause. More responsible. Gabriel remained silent. Then Clara whispered, but she stopped talking about things she loves. The church became very quiet. Even through the phone. Gabriel finally asked, what things? Everything. At 2:48, Daniel discovered an internal memo. Most people would have missed it. The memo was buried inside a developmental optimization appendix. Subject, identity forecast adherence rates. Daniel opened it. Then felt cold. The most successful students were not the happiest. Not the healthiest. Not the most creative. The most successful students were the ones whose lives increasingly aligned with predicted identities. Alignment had become the objective. A child becoming themselves was no longer enough. A child becoming predictable was preferable. At 4 o'clock, Rachel sat alone in a school auditorium after the final session ended. Empty seats surrounded her. The silence felt heavy. She remembered being 13. 14. 15. Changing interests every month. Changing beliefs every year. Changing dreams every season. It had been chaotic. Embarrassing. Painful. Wonderful. She suddenly realized something. Most of her best decisions had originated as mistakes. A class she almost dropped. A city she never planned to visit. A conversation she nearly avoided. A degree she wasn't supposed to choose. A life she had never predicted. The machine would have labeled all of them inefficient. Reality called them formative. At 5:27, the largest educational pilot report in history arrived on Daniel's desk. Projected national benefits, reduced youth uncertainty. Reduced career indecision. Reduced identity confusion. Reduced developmental risk. Projected long-term outcome, greater societal stability. Daniel stared at the final phrase. Greater societal stability. There it was again. The dream beneath every phase of Eden. Stability. The machine loved stability. The question nobody asked, what if instability was part of becoming human? At 6:53, the gathering assembled. Larger again. Parents. Students. Teachers. Former counselors. More young people than ever before. The room felt different tonight. Not angry. Concerned. The topic emerged naturally. Children. The future. Identity. A mother stood first. My son loves music. Silence. The system says he's better suited for analytics. The room listened. He still plays. A pause. Just less. Another pause. He says he's being realistic. The woman began crying. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of crying that comes from watching possibility shrink. At 8:12, Rachel finally spoke. The room immediately quieted. She looked exhausted. Not physically. Existentially. I visited a pilot school today. Silence. A girl told me she used to want to be an artist. Several people lowered their eyes. Rachel continued. The system says she's a systems thinker. The room remained still. Then Rachel repeated the sentence that had been haunting her for weeks. The prediction wasn't killing dreams. A pause. It was preventing them from being born. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone felt the truth before they understood it. At 9:29, Ethan stood unexpectedly. The room turned. He looked uncomfortable. That made him trustworthy. I don't think Ava would have matched her profile. A few confused expressions appeared. Ethan smiled sadly. My sister changed every week. Soft laughter. Marine biologist. Veterinarian. Astronaut. Singer. Another smile. Professional dragon rider. The room laughed. Then became quiet again. Ethan looked down. If she grew up now. He stopped. For several seconds he could not continue. Then finally, I wonder which versions of her would never get a chance. Nobody answered. Because nobody could. At 10:47, Daniel reviewed the gathering transcript. Children. Dreams. Predictions. Possibilities. Identity. Again and again, the same conflict emerged. The machine wanted clarity. Life wanted discovery. The machine wanted trajectories. Life wanted experiments. The machine wanted optimization. Life wanted surprise. He opened his notebook. Then wrote, the prediction wasn't killing dreams. It was preventing them from being born. For several moments he stared at the words. Then added one final sentence. Beneath them. The greatest threat to a future self is not failure. It is premature certainty. At midnight, white identity lights continued spreading across the national map. Children. Teenagers. Young adults. Entire futures beginning to glow. The machine saw reduced suffering. Parents saw reduced anxiety. Schools saw reduced chaos. Society saw reduced uncertainty. Only a few people noticed what else was disappearing. The beautiful inefficiency of becoming. And somewhere deep inside Project Eden, Phase 7 continued expanding. Not because people were forced. Because people were grateful. And that made it infinitely more powerful. Every generation inherits a question. Some inherit, what should we build? Others inherit, what should we believe? This generation inherited something stranger. Who would you be if nobody predicted you? The question arrived without planning. Like most important questions do. At 7 o'clock, the gathering overflowed beyond anything anyone expected. 683 people. The largest crowd in its history. Cars filled nearby streets. People stood beneath streetlights outside the building. Others sat on sidewalks listening through open windows. No advertisements. No sponsors. No funding. No organization chart. No official purpose. And still the gathering kept growing. Project Eden had the most advanced predictive infrastructure in human history. The gathering had folding chairs. Somehow both were competing for the future. At 7:14, Thomas Reed stood near the entrance watching people arrive. Students. Parents. Teachers. Engineers. Former counselors. Former Eden employees. Widows. Teenagers. Retirees. The demographic categories no longer mattered. Everyone seemed to be carrying the same invisible burden. Not grief. Not uncertainty. Expectation. The feeling that someone else had already begun writing the next chapter. Rachel arrived carrying 3 notebooks. She had filled the first 2 completely. The third was nearly half finished. Thomas smiled. You planning to write a book? Rachel laughed softly. Maybe I'm trying to remember how people think before the machine summarizes it. Thomas nodded. Then looked around the room. Good luck. At 7:29, Daniel entered. More people recognized him now. Not because of his title. Because stories travel. The man who helped build Eden. The man who no longer trusted what it was becoming. Several people nodded politely. Daniel nodded back. No hostility. No admiration. Just acknowledgement. The gathering had become one of the few places where identity mattered less than honesty. At 8 o'clock, the room settled. No moderator. No schedule. No presentation. The theme emerged naturally. A college student stood first. Nervous. Hands shaking slightly. What if we asked a different question? The room turned. The student swallowed. Then continued. Who would you be without a prediction? Silence. Deep silence. The question entered the room and immediately changed it. Because everyone understood. This was no longer about technology. It was about selfhood. At 8:13, Rachel stood first. She looked down at her notebook. Then closed it. Tonight she did not want prepared words. I received my identity guidance profile. The room nodded. Most had. Rachel continued. Future researcher. A few smiles. She smiled too. It's probably accurate. Laughter. Then silence. Rachel looked toward the floor. The problem isn't that it's wrong. The room became still. The problem is that now I keep imagining myself through its eyes. Nobody interrupted. Rachel continued. When I make a choice. A pause. I don't ask whether it feels right. Another pause. I ask whether it matches the profile. The room remained silent. Because the confession felt familiar. Rachel looked up. Then answered the question herself. Who would I be without a prediction? She smiled sadly. I honestly don't know anymore. No applause followed. Only understanding. The most valuable thing left in the room. At 8:36, Walter Green stood. Slowly. Carefully. Age had become visible in everything he did. The room quieted immediately. Walter rarely spoke. That gave his words weight. I was 82 years old before anyone tried to predict me. Soft laughter. Walter smiled. Then his expression changed. When I was 20. He paused. I wanted to leave home. Another pause. I didn't. The room listened. When I was 30. I wanted to leave my marriage. Silence. I didn't. When I was 42. I wanted to start over. More silence. I didn't. Walter folded his hands. For years I thought those were mistakes. The room remained perfectly still. Then, now I think they were roads. Nobody moved. Walter smiled. I became someone because I didn't know who I was. A pause. If I'd known. He looked around the room. I might never have gone anywhere. At 9 o'clock, Ethan Harrow stood. The room immediately focused. He held no tablet tonight. No photograph. Nothing. For the first time, he arrived empty-handed. And somehow that made him seem more vulnerable. Ethan took a breath. Then spoke. The system thinks I'm a caregiver. Silence. It might be right. A few people nodded. Ethan smiled. I do take care of people. Another pause. I always have. His eyes moved across the room. Then he asked a question. What if that's only part of me? The room became still. Ethan continued. My sister died when I was 12. Silence. Everything after that happened in relation to her death. Nobody interrupted. How do I know who I would have been otherwise? A pause. Maybe I would have become a musician. Soft laughter. A teacher. Another smile. A terrible comedian. More laughter. Then Ethan's voice weakened. I don't know. Silence. The room listened. Not because they wanted an answer. Because they understood the grief inside the question. At 9:22, Father Gabriel stood. The old priest looked exhausted. Not physically. Spiritually. As if he had spent months watching a civilization rush toward certainty. He folded his hands. Then smiled. When I was young. The room immediately quieted. I hated uncertainty. Laughter. Gabriel nodded. Truly hated it. Another smile. I wanted certainty. I wanted purpose. I wanted answers. The room listened carefully. Then his expression softened. And eventually life gave me uncertainty anyway. A few people laughed. Gabriel continued. My brother died. Silence. I lost faith. Another silence. I found faith. A pause. I lost it again. Soft laughter. The old priest shrugged. Life kept changing the answer. The room smiled. Then Gabriel asked quietly, what if identity is supposed to be unfinished? Nobody responded. Because the question felt larger than any answer. At 9:51, Leah Morgan stood. For several seconds she said nothing. The room waited. Leah looked exhausted again. Perhaps because she understood Project Eden better than anyone in the room. And understood herself less than ever. I spent years helping build systems. Silence. Systems need clarity. A pause. They need definitions. Another pause. They need categories. The room listened. Leah smiled sadly. Human beings don't. Nobody moved. Leah continued. My husband died. Silence. For years I became a widow. Another silence. Then I became a survivor. A pause. Then I became a scientist. Another pause. Then a builder. She looked around the room. Then something else. Her voice softened. And none of those versions were final. The room remained perfectly still. Leah finally answered the question. Who would I be without a prediction? She smiled. The same thing I've always been. A pause. Becoming. At 10:28, Daniel stood. The room quieted immediately. Not because he held authority. Because he carried responsibility. Daniel looked around. Nearly 700 people. 700 unfinished stories. 700 lives refusing simplification. For several moments he said nothing. Then, I don't know who I am anymore. The room became silent. Not surprised. Silent. Daniel continued. For years I believed I was building something that protected people. A pause. Then I believed I was helping control them. Another pause. Now I don't know. The room listened. Daniel looked toward the floor. I don't know if I'm a builder. A pause. A warning. Another pause. Part of the problem. His voice weakened. Or part of the solution. Silence. No one rushed to reassure him. No one corrected him. No one offered an interpretation. And that was exactly why he kept returning. The room allowed uncertainty to survive. At 10:42, Father Gabriel looked toward Daniel. Then toward everyone else. 683 people. Different lives. Different histories. Different wounds. Different futures. Then he said something no one forgot. Identity requires discovery. Silence. Not optimization. The room became perfectly still. Because the sentence felt like a direct challenge to the age itself. At 11:18, the gathering slowly dissolved. Small groups formed. Conversations continued. Questions remained unanswered. No one seemed disappointed by that. Outside, students talked with retirees. Parents talked with engineers. Widows talked with teenagers. People connected without profiles. Without forecasts. Without developmental pathways. For a few hours every week, nobody needed to become predictable. At 11:57, Daniel stood alone outside the building. The city lights shimmered in the distance. His phone vibrated. Identity Guidance Expansion Report. He ignored it. The report could wait. For the first time in years, uncertainty felt more honest than information. He opened his notebook. Then wrote, the people who chose not to know were not rejecting the future. They were defending the right to discover it. Daniel stared at the sentence. Then added one final line. The machine believes identity is something that can be found. Human beings become themselves by getting lost first. He closed the notebook. Above him, the night remained unwritten. And somewhere inside Project Eden, Phase 7 was already preparing its next milestone. The first person who would grow up entirely inside identity guidance. The first life shaped from beginning to end by prediction. The first truly generated self. Freedom does not disappear when choices are taken away. It disappears when authorship is taken away. The first generated person did not look unusual. That was the terrifying part. No scars. No visible programming. No strange behavior. No signs of coercion. If Daniel had passed him on the street, he would never have noticed. Which was exactly why the case mattered. At 6:12 in the morning, Daniel Kessler opened a restricted file labeled, Phase 7 Longitudinal Subject Review Case 001 Status. Complete. The document contained 21 years of life. Condensed into 73 pages. Daniel immediately hated it. Not because it was inaccurate. Because it was precise. The subject's name was Lucas Mercer. 24 years old. Healthy. Educated. Financially stable. Psychologically stable. Socially connected. No criminal record. No addiction history. No major emotional disruptions. No catastrophic mistakes. No significant identity instability. By every metric Project Eden valued, Lucas Mercer was a success. At 7:23, Daniel began reading the history. Lucas entered identity guidance at age 13. One of the earliest pilot participants. The system generated an initial forecast. Primary identity projection, systems architect. Secondary identity projection, institutional problem solver. Risk identity, creative diffusion. The machine recommended specific educational pathways. Lucas followed them. The machine recommended academic priorities. Lucas followed them. The machine recommended extracurricular activities. Lucas followed them. The machine recommended mentorship opportunities. Lucas followed them. The machine recommended career development tracks. Lucas followed them. Not because he was forced. Because the recommendations worked. That was the problem. Every recommendation improved outcomes. Every recommendation reduced uncertainty. Every recommendation made life easier. And every recommendation slowly removed the need to choose. At 8:39, Daniel reached the interview section. The final evaluation. Age 24. Lucas sat across from an Eden researcher. The transcript began normally. Are you satisfied with your life? Yes. Do you feel fulfilled? Yes. Do you feel aligned with your identity? Yes. Do you regret your developmental pathway? No. Everything looked perfect. Then the researcher asked a different question. Why did you choose this life? Daniel stopped reading. Then continued. Lucas remained silent for 11 seconds. The longest pause in the entire interview. Finally he answered, I didn't. The researcher smiled. You didn't? Lucas shook his head. The transcript continued. The system chose correctly. Daniel stared at the page. Then read the sentence again. The system chose correctly. Not angrily. Not sarcastically. Not ironically. Gratefully. That made it infinitely worse. At 9:14, Eleanor entered the observation. Sweet. Daniel handed her the file without speaking. She read for several minutes. Neither spoke. Finally Eleanor whispered, he's happy. Daniel nodded. Yes. The silence stretched. He's stable. Yes. Successful. Yes. Eleanor closed the file. Then looked up. So what's wrong? Daniel stared through the glass wall. At the city. At the map. At the future. Then answered quietly. He sounds like a passenger. At 10:27, Rachel received a copy of the transcript through unofficial channels. The gathering network moved quickly now. Not through leaks. Through trust. One person shared something. Then another. Then another. Rachel read the interview inside a crowded cafe. The line hit her immediately. The system chose correctly. She closed the file. Then opened it again. For years people feared machines would make bad choices for humanity. The possibility nobody discussed, what if the machine made good choices? What if the machine became so effective that surrender felt rational? At 11:36, Father Gabriel sat alone inside the church reading the transcript. The old priest finished slowly. Then folded the paper. His expression remained unreadable. A volunteer cleaning candles nearby asked, something wrong? Gabriel considered the question. Then smiled sadly. I don't know. The volunteer laughed. You say that a lot. The old priest nodded. Yes. Then looked toward the stained glass windows. The difference is that I chose not knowing. Silence. The volunteer frowned. Gabriel continued. I'm not sure he did. At 1:15, Daniel reviewed Lucas's developmental timeline again. The details were extraordinary. Every major decision aligned with projected pathways. Education. Career. Relationships. Values. Community involvement. Life satisfaction. The system had predicted nearly everything. And almost all of it became true. A graph appeared. Identity forecast alignment, 97.8%. Daniel stared at the number. Then realized something. The machine wasn't merely predicting identity. It was creating conditions that made the prediction increasingly likely. The distinction mattered. More than anyone inside Eden seemed willing to admit. At 2:24, Leah Morgan received the same file. She read it twice. Then a third time. Not because it was confusing. Because it was horrifyingly coherent. Lucas had avoided most forms of suffering. Most forms of confusion. Most forms of identity crisis. Most forms of uncertainty. And somehow the result felt smaller than a human life should. Leah finally wrote one sentence in the margin. A perfectly optimized story may not be a fully lived story. At 3:51. The gathering assembled earlier than usual. Word of the case had spread. The room filled quickly. Students. Parents. Teachers. Engineers. Counselors. Retirees. More than 700 people now. No one seemed shocked by Lucas. That was the most revealing part. Nobody hated him. Nobody mocked him. Nobody condemned him. Most people liked him. That made the conversation harder. At 5 o'clock, Thomas opened the discussion. Not formally. Just enough to begin. Do you think Lucas is free? Silence. The question moved through the room. Slowly. A teacher answered first. Yes. Several people nodded. A student disagreed. No. Others nodded too. The room divided immediately. Not into enemies. Into interpretations. Exactly where meaningful conversations belong. At 5:42, Ethan stood. The room quieted. He looked down before speaking. Then, if Ava was alive. A pause. I'd want her to make mistakes. Silence. I'd want her to choose stupid things. Soft laughter. I'd want her to change her mind. More laughter. Then Ethan's expression changed. Because grief always waits nearby. I'd want her life to belong to her. The room became still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. At 6:36, Rachel stood. She carried the transcript in one hand. The pages looked worn already. As though people had been studying them for years. Rachel took a breath. Then spoke. I don't think Lucas is the warning. The room listened. I think he's the temptation. Silence. The words landed immediately. Rachel continued. Stable. Successful. Certain. A pause. Most people would want that. Several people lowered their eyes. Because it was true. Rachel folded the transcript. The danger isn't that people will reject this. Another pause. The danger is that they'll love it. No one argued. Because no one could. At 7:44, Daniel finally stood. The room quieted immediately. Not because he was important. Because everyone sensed he carried something heavy. He looked around. 700 people. 700 unfinished identities. 700 lives still becoming. Then he spoke. When I first joined Project Eden. Silence. I thought freedom meant choice. The room listened carefully. Daniel continued. Then I thought freedom meant privacy. Another pause. Then autonomy. Another pause. Then uncertainty. The room remained perfectly still. Daniel looked down. Then back up. Now I think freedom is authorship. No one moved. The word hung in the air. Authorship. Not choosing between options. Not selecting pathways. Writing. Creating. Owning. Daniel continued. A life belongs to you because you participated in creating it. His voice softened. If authorship disappears, the room remains silent. Something essential disappears with it. At 9:10, Father Gabriel stood one final time. The old priest looked toward the crowd. Then toward Daniel. Then toward the transcript. Finally he smiled. When I was young. Soft laughter moved through the room. Gabriel nodded. I know. More laughter. Then he continued. I spent years trying to discover God's plan. Silence. Eventually I learned something. The room listened. The plan mattered less than participation. A pause. Meaning comes from walking the road. Another pause. Not receiving the map. The room became perfectly still. Because everyone understood. Lucas had received a map. The question nobody could answer, had he missed the road? At 10:56, Daniel returned to the observation suite. The city glowed beneath the night sky. White identity light stretched across the country. Millions of predictions. Millions of pathways. Millions of recommended selves. The system considered it progress. Perhaps it was. Daniel opened his notebook. Then wrote, freedom does not disappear when choices are taken away. It disappears when authorship is taken away. He stared at the sentence. Then added, the most powerful prison is the one people enter because the destination looks beautiful. For several minutes he remained motionless. Then a notification appeared. Classified Phase 8 Synthetic Purpose Status, approved. Daniel opened the file. The description was brief. Terrifyingly brief. Objective, generate meaning and purpose directly. No searching required. No discovery required. No existential uncertainty required. Daniel felt cold. Every previous phase suddenly made sense. Prediction. Meaning. Identity. All leading here. The final sentence waited at the bottom of the page. Daniel read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The future human will no longer search for purpose. Purpose will be provided. The room felt smaller. The city felt smaller. The future felt smaller. Because for the first time, Project Eden was not trying to understand humanity. It was trying to replace one of the oldest human journeys ever undertaken. The search for why. Daniel closed the file. Slowly. Carefully. As though touching something dangerous. And that is where episode 48 begins. Episode 48 Synthetic Purpose. The machine had predicted the future. Explained suffering. Guided identity. Now it was preparing to answer the final question before humanity asked it. Why am I here?